Welcome to Cavalier News. My name is Jamesia Thomas, and today we will be discussing how Asian immigrants are taking over the job market. As we know, since 1848, popular labor attractions like the California Gold Rush has drawn immigrants to the United States. And now the American people are faced with an even greater threat with the newly reformed immigration laws. The Immigration Act of 1964 and the Control Act of 1986 has overall increased the immigration pattern in the United States. The United States has been forced to make a cultural and social shift due to these laws, and citizens are not happy about it. In today's news segment, we will be covering three aspects: the laws that help keep the presence of Asian immigrants minimum, and the change in those immigration laws that have enforced greater acceptance of Asian immigrants, and lastly, the social costs of the laws on Asian immigrants.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law that excluded individuals who sought to immigrate to the United States based on their racial, ethnic group, or nationality. The Chinese Exclusion Act was deemed acceptable during this time period due to the fear that Chinese laborers would take over the workforce. For example, in areas in the West Coast, like California during the California Gold Rush, were especially prone to declining wages and economic liberties for Asian immigrant workers. These Asian immigrants have been portrayed as barbarians threatening American civilization and culture. Quoted by Park. The Immigration Act of 1924 restricted the number of immigrants allowed to immigrate into the United States according to the national origins quota. The national origin quota was not based on the size of the country, which would have been rational, that the immigrants came from, but based on the nationality of the immigrant. The national origin quota allowed for 2% of the visas for immigrants to come to the United States. Jane Ting's article covered the Nationality Act of 1940, which stated that persons of white descent, African descent, and Native people were eligible to become a naturalized citizen. In other words, everyone was salutatorily eligible to become naturalized except Asians. These are just a few discriminatory policies that withheld Asian immigrants from becoming a naturalized citizen and coming to America as immigrants. Even in today's immigration acts, the preceding ones play a major role in today's immigration laws. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Asian immigrants were completely marginalized as a whole. In essence, they were victims of prejudiced beliefs, resentment, and racial hatred by white America. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the Nationality Act of 1940 are a few of the discriminatory laws enforced during the 20th century that captured the increasing distance between the Asian and white immigration patterns and acceptance in the United States. The differences that were identified were political, cultural, and social, in which Asian immigrants were viewed upon as lesser than the typical American citizen.
Beginning in the 1960s, the government made changes to the immigration policy of the United States. The Immigration Act of 1965 allowed large-scale immigration into the U.S. based on having skills to work or having a relationship to a current legal resident of the nation. This repealed the previous system of quotas that had discriminated due to race, as it ensured that most of the immigrants coming to the United States were actually from North and South Europe. This act resulted in an influx of immigrants from Africa, Southeast Europe, and Asia, the area that had been previously restricted by the quotas. Another reform to the immigration policy was the Immigration and Control Act of 1986. This law also served to decrease the amount of racial and ethnic discrimination in the immigration system. It did so by moving the focus away from how many immigrants were entering the country to if the people entering were doing so legally. This increased the number of Asian immigrants as they were already sought after for labor, which due to the Immigration Act of 1965 was a major factor in allowing immigrants into the U.S. All of these reforms led to the stereotypical views of Asian Americans and the discriminatory practices that would later affect them.
Immigration laws didn't simply restrict the number of Asian immigrants coming to the U.S., they also embodied a culture of anti-Asian sentiment amongst U.S. citizens. In this segment, I will depict what life was like for Asian immigrant families during this time. First, we will look at the treatment of Asian immigrants upon arriving to the U.S. Oftentimes, when arriving in the U.S., Asian immigrants were held for months at immigration offices. The officers there would sometimes make up medical reasons as to why someone couldn't enter the country. This led to many men coming to the U.S. alone, leaving their families behind so they didn't have to endure the struggle of entry to the U.S. This breaking up of families was just one negative consequence of immigration policy during this time. Furthermore, the separation of families had other consequences. Asians often worked low-class jobs in the United States, and because their families were back in Asia, they saved the money to send home. Americans were noticing that the Asian population was increasing on the West Coast, and with it they noticed that Asians only spent money on what they needed and sent the rest of the money home. Additionally, they only purchased goods from other Asian immigrants. This caused resentment to rise amongst Americans as they began to think that the Asians weren't adding anything to the economy or to American culture. Asian immigration also began to pick up when mining coal was still important to production in the economy. Many Asian immigrants were coming to America and taking the cheap labor mining jobs from Americans. This bred resentment within many Americans toward the Asians and laid a foundation for policy on immigration in the coming years. Asian coal miners often suffered brutal attacks from Americans because of the growing disdain between the groups. These were sentiments that began in the late 1800s and continued into the mid-20th century. While these sentiments manifested themselves in immigration policy, the many wars that the United States fought in Asia also contributed to the overall dissent that Americans had for Asian immigrants. Ultimately, the immigration policy of this time period kept Asian immigration low. With low numbers in the United States, the Asian population here was easily marginalized. The breakup of family units and the intense discrimination that Asians felt in the United States were terrible social effects of anti-Asian policies of the time.